We had a special session of the Utah Legislature yesterday, Tuesday, and they made some changes to essentially buy some more time with the redistricting lawsuit. They bought some time so they can appeal it to the Utah Supreme Court and possibly the U.S. Supreme Court in an effort to make it so they don't have to use the maps that were imposed, approved, put in place by 3rd District Judge Diana Gibson last month. And I've been saying this over and over and over again. This is not done until we reach the filing date. And the main thing that the legislature did yesterday is they moved the filing date for congressional candidates. Moved it back to give them more time for this appeal. So hopefully, at least from their point of view, they can get rid of the map that was the plaintiff's map, map 1, that was put in place by Judge Diana Gibson. And ultimately, they would like to go back to the 2021 map that they passed that was thrown out by Judge Gibson because they illegally or unconstitutionally overturned Proposition 4. So basically, they're going to be moving back the filing deadline to give themselves some more time to have that appeal process. And they also changed some court rules so that they can start the appeals process right away. That's the main thing they did during the legislative session yesterday. So leave your questions in the chat and I will try to get to them as quickly as possible. And I'll try to explain what happened and where we go from here. M. Gallantly on Instagram says, I'm so glad the Ledge called a special session to tell us all about their hurt fifis. Essentially, yes. They don't like being told no. They're up in arms. Again, I do think that they have a legitimate beef with some of the things that happened. I think they had a legitimate beef with who gets to draw the map because the judge did not follow the process in Prop 4. I think that because the Utah Constitution says that it's the legislature that will draw the maps. Now, Prop 4 tried to get around that by saying they would present 3 maps to the legislature and the legislature had to choose one or reject them. The legislature could draw their own map, but they had to explain why they rejected the map from the independent commission and where the independent commission maps were insufficient. That was the process under Prop 4. We had no time to do the process under Prop 4 this time around. So that's why we're here. What the legislature did is they changed some rules. Any lawsuit in the future over redistricting or elections, that's going to go straight to the Supreme Court. We're not going to muck around in the lower courts at all. They're going to go straight to the Supreme Court with that. And they also changed the rules to make it so that they can appeal immediately. Those bills will go into effect immediately, meaning that the appeals will start right away. And they're hoping that they can buy some time, or hoping that they now have some time to appeal this decision to the Utah Supreme Court, possibly to the U.S. Supreme Court. Because make no mistake, they want the map that they passed in 2021, the super gerrymandered map. They want that one to remain in place. They want to use that one for the 2026 midterm election. That's what they're doing. So they moved the filing deadline only for congressional candidates. Everybody has to start filing for office on the 2nd of January. That's the first day, and it runs for a week. Now, everybody can start filing then, except for the congressional candidates. Now, congressional candidates can start collecting signatures if they want to petition their way on the ballot, but they also inserted something into the law, and this is a one-time change that gives them a chance to hedge their bets. So they can file for another office. They can file for state senate. If they want to run for Congress, they can file for state senate. They can file for state house, any of the other county offices that are up for election next year. They can file for those. But when the congressional filing deadline opens in March, right after the legislature ends on March 6th. I believe the congressional filing deadline starts on the 9th. That'll be the Monday after that. They will have to drop out of the other race. So they can collect signatures. Candidates can collect signatures for 2 offices. I wonder if Nate Blumen's going to do that. He's already said he's going to run for Congress under this 1st congressional district on the map that's currently in place. But if he does that, he has to give up his seat in the state senate. Does he file to run for re-election in the state senate? That remains to be seen, but he'll be able to collect signatures. They also made it easier to collect signatures for candidates in Congress. Normally, you have to get 7,000 signatures from registered voters who can vote for you in the primary. So for Republicans, that means they have to get it from registered Republicans because only registered Republicans can vote in the primary. For Democrats, they can get signatures from registered voters who are either Democrat or unaffiliated. And you normally have to get those signatures from your congressional district. So if you're running in the 1st district, they have to be voters in the 1st district. And you need 7,000 signatures. They changed the rules for this time only where you can get them statewide. It does not matter which congressional district you're in. So that'll make it a little bit easier for these candidates to collect signatures. One, because they don't know which district they'll be collecting signatures in, or which district they would need to collect signatures because they don't know where they're running. And secondly, the time frame is going to be incredibly compressed. So those are the two big changes they made to election law. And those are only in place for the 2026 election. M. Gallaty on Instagram asks, is there a way to amend the state constitution by proposition? Because this game of Calvinball they're playing needs to end. Lifetime gerrymanders shouldn't be a birthright. Unfortunately, no. The only entity that can propose a constitutional amendment is the legislature. I suppose you could do an indirect initiative which forces lawmakers to take a vote on something, but then you would need to collect half as many signatures as you do for a direct initiative, which is 4% of registered voters in the state. But then you would need to get the legislators 2/3 to vote on it. You need to get 2/3 in both houses to put it on the ballot. So I think that's possible. I haven't looked into that completely, but for the most part, that would be highly unlikely. So only the legislature can propose a constitutional amendment. But I like the fact that you mentioned that this is Calvinball, where they just change the rules as they go. That's essentially what they're doing. Howells for Utah says, that means we got to run and replace these folks in the legislature. I've said this before, and I've said this, and I'll say it again. One of the reasons why lawmakers do this, one of the reasons why they are so brazen in the way that they're operating and changing the rules as they go, is because they have not suffered any consequences. If you look at what's happened electorally, they have not been punished at the ballot box. So it seems like voters are on board with what they're doing, or at least that's what it feels like, because otherwise they would have been punished. They have not lost a large number of seats. In fact, the Republican caucus has only gotten bigger. It actually, I think last year was the first time it had held steady at 61 out of 75 seats in the House. They lost a seat in Salt Lake County, but they gained a seat in the Ogden area by knocking out Democrat Rosemary Lesser. So they haven't been punished for that. And that's the only thing that usually gets legislators to change their behavior, is losing. It's a very, very powerful incentive. And the fact that they have not been punished at the ballot box for what they did to Prop 4, for changing the medical cannabis initiative, for changing the Medicaid expansion initiative, they didn't suffer any consequences for that. So why wouldn't you continue to do that? So we're changing the dates for the 2026 election, the filing dates. At the same time, the state Republican Party is collecting signatures for a ballot initiative to repeal Prop 4. And that's one of the reasons why they decided to repeal the union busting bill in yesterday's special session. They were highly aware that voters were very mad about this. The fact that the labor unions were able to collect so many signatures in such a short period of time, and then you look at what's happening around the country with a Democratic overperformance, I can tell you, I've spoken to several people, one of the reasons why lawmakers did this is because they were worried about giving voters an incentive to go to the polls. They do not want a bunch of voters mad at them showing up at the polls, especially when they've got two things on the ballot or there are going to be at least two things on the ballot that they really want. One is the ballot initiative to repeal Prop 4, which is being run by the state Republican Party and completely funded by one out-of-state, shadowy, dark money group, the same thing that they complain about all the time. And two, they're going to have a constitutional amendment. You remember Amendment D, which they rushed into session last year, that would change the Constitution to give them the ability to change, override, repeal any ballot initiative, the one the judge threw out because they didn't get it noticed in time. They didn't follow the actual Constitution and the constitutional requirements for putting this on the ballot. That's why it got nixed. They're bringing that back again. So they're going to have two things that they want their voters to show up for. They're going to want their voters to show up and vote to overturn, repeal Prop 4. And they're going to want their voters to show up and approve this constitutional amendment that will give them the ability to repeal and change without any consequence any ballot initiative that's approved by voters. And they didn't want a bunch of voters who were mad at them showing up at the polls. So that's why they repealed the union busting effort. That's why they repealed it, because they did not want to give voters incentive to show up at the polls next year who would have a reason to vote against the things that they want. So they were taking that off the table. That is I am 100% confident in my reporting that that's the reason why they repealed it. They were shocked at how quickly the labor unions were able to collect enough signatures to put that referendum on the ballot. And they did not want those organizing efforts from the unions turned against them. And now the unions don't have any incentive to, rally a bunch of their supporters. They might do it anyway, but the one thing that they wanted to get rid of, the one thing that they wanted to overturn is now off the table, which is a classic move. You pass something that's very controversial, and then when you see just how unpopular it is, you quietly make it go away. And that's what they're doing. They're taking it off the table, taking it off the board before the 2026 election. Christy Henshaw on Instagram says, yep, and when we tried to hold them accountable, they passed SB 54. We agree on this. SB 54 is, I know what you're talking about now. I understand what you're bringing up. And Christy, you're right. She's SB 54, which created the signature path to the ballot for candidates. That was a compromise because there was a ballot initiative in the works that was going to get rid of the caucus and convention system for nominating candidates, get rid of it completely. And it was going to pass. If you look at all the polling at the time, that was going to pass. And I don't think it was going to be close. And lawmakers understood that was an existential threat to the caucus and convention system. So they decided to cut this compromise. That's the thing that they do when a ballot initiative that they know they're not going to be able to stop, that is very popular, is about to go into effect. That's the thing that they do. They make a compromise. They made a compromise with Count My Vote to create SB 54, and then they've spent the last decade or so trying to repeal that. And then, if you remember, I think it was back in 2018, there was a group called Our Schools Now. Maybe it was 2020. A group of business leaders, and they were going to it was going to put a whole bunch of money into the public education. I think it was going to cap class sizes and put a whole bunch of money into public education. And lawmakers did not want that appearing on the ballot. So they cut a deal with Our Schools Now, and they created some framework that actually was a pretty good deal. They made it so that if there are any cuts to education, there's an emergency fund that they're building up. Education has to start at the same funding level it was last year, and lawmakers they're required by statute to fund any classroom growth. And so that's where most of the increases in education over the past couple of years have come from. This funding level that they have to set before the session, they did it earlier this week, and I'm starting to dig into that. Oh, by the way, they said that this is going to be a meager budget year because they're going to collect $200 million less in income taxes, maybe up to $500 million less in income taxes than they did last year. And that's because of the tax cuts at the federal level. Well, that conveniently ignores the fact that they cut taxes here in the state by close to $1 billion over the last 4 years. And most of the benefits of that have gone to the top income earners in the state, the upper 1%. I think some analyses I've seen 80% of the benefits of those tax cuts have gone to the top 20% of earners, and actually most of that 80% goes to even the top of the top in that 20%, even the top 5% and above. So lawmakers cut a bunch of taxes over the last 4 years, but now they're going to have income taxes lower than expected, and they're blaming it on the federal tax cuts, completely ignoring their own tax cuts. By the way, the tax cuts they implemented here in Utah, income tax, that's money that could go to public schools. And it's future revenue. When they do a tax cut, then you have to subtract how much money could go into the schools in the future. And that's something that's in the Constitution. The Constitution says that income tax revenue can only be used to pay for public education, higher education, and there was an amendment a few years ago that can pay for some social services for disabled Utahns. And they have been itching to find a way to change that constitutional earmark for years. They were going to put a constitutional amendment on the ballot last year. That was Amendment A, that would open up that earmark, that would allow them to tap the income tax money and put it towards other places in the budget. And the teachers oppose that. And that's the reason why we got the union busting bill. The union busting bill was there 100% as retaliation for the teachers' unions opposing their attempt to change how public schools are funded under the Constitution. That's why it was there. All of this is connected. Randomly Ski on TikTok says, is the union bill backstep just deployed to file something different in January? Here's the thing. Nothing is stopping a future legislature from trying that again. Even if they repealed it by the referendum, a future legislature could try it again. The only reason a referendum was even possible this time around is because it did not pass with 2/3 in both the House and the Senate. Those are the rules. If you can pass a law with a 2/3 majority in both the House and the Senate here in Utah, a referendum is not possible. And the union busting bill passed without that 2/3 majority in the House and Senate, so that's why they could have a referendum. If you go all the way back to 2007, the legislature, by like one vote, passed a bill that created the first universal vouchers program in the state. It actually was the first universal vouchers program in the entire nation. It was an effort that was funded by Patrick Byrne, who was the former chairman of Overstock CEO before he completely lost his mind. But he poured a lot of money into that effort. And the legislature, I think somebody flipped their vote on the last day, and so it passed. And once again, the teachers' unions mobilize. They get enough signatures to put that referendum on the ballot, and then it gets crushed at the ballot. And lawmakers didn't try it again until they brought the Utah Fits All Now scholarship, which is not a scholarship. It's a vouchers program, just with a fancier name. And they passed that, and they made sure they had 2/3 in both the House and the Senate. So that's why that one survived while the 2007 one didn't, because they were able to get the 2/3 and there wasn't the ability for the voters to overturn it at the polls. And that's why it's still there. So there's nothing stopping the lawmakers from trying this again. And I suspect that they might. This is the kind of, they've been wanting to do this for years. They've been sort of in a détente with the Utah Education Association since that 2007 initiative, the referendum over the school vouchers back then, and they got spanked at the ballot box. And they've been looking for ways to punish the UEA ever since. And this union busting bill, it was a big priority of the group Utah Parents United, which they hate public education. It's a bunch of homeschoolers. And they were pushing this big time before the session. And the fact that they had to repeal this, they're not happy about it. And they'd like to see this changed again because they don't like the teachers' unions. So I hope that answers your question. There's nothing that's stopping them from doing this again. And I suspect that they might. Lo-Fi Mexican Cooking says they cut income taxes for 4 years straight, and now they're complaining about low revenue. Exactly. That's the point that I was making earlier. That amendment for social services is going to be their doorway to take the income tax money away. It's really hard. Right after that constitutional amendment passed, the joke up on the Hill was everybody was trying to find a way to make their program one of those social services. It's pretty narrowly defined. So I understand what you're saying, but they really can't do that. That constitutional earmark for public education funding, it's pretty rock solid. They've been trying to find a way to get around it for years. They don't like that restriction. Utah is the only state in the union that does this. No other state has this bifurcated budget where there's two separate buckets of money, and one bucket can only go for certain things, and then the other bucket is for everything else. Utah's the only state in the union that does this. And they would like a lot more budget flexibility. That's why they want to do this. But the problem is their motivation is so cartoonishly transparent that they're doing it to get back at the teachers union for daring to stand up against them. Christy Henshaw says there should be a cap on property taxes or people could potentially lose their houses. They've been trying to figure out a way around that one for a long time. There's not a lot that they can do at the state level about the property taxes. That is a local issue. That is further down the chain. The state really doesn't have a lot to do with that. Philly G801 says, what is this news about Speaker Adams selling land? That's a really good report from the Utah Investigative Journalism Project. They've got some good reporters over there. And Stuart Adams is a land developer, and he sold some land to the state for a lot of money. And it looks like it might have been above market value. Stuart Adams is not hurting for money. And he sold a bunch of money to the state. Do you think the state's going to really push back at him? I mean, it's easy to make those assumptions. I didn't do the reporting, but go over and read that at the Utah Investigative Journalism Project. It's a really good story. They do some good work over there, and it's worth a read. They got up there pretending they care so much about the teachers. This is a comment from TikTok. They got up there pretending they care so much about the teachers. I wish I would have recorded the poll call I got about all of this back in early November. And lawmakers, they talk a big game about teachers, but what you have to understand, when they get up there and they hold hands and they say, we gave this much money to teachers, most of those increases are not discretionary. It's what they are required to do because of that deal they made with Our Schools Now. They made a deal with Our Schools Now, and they are required to fund education at a certain level. And when they cut taxes by as much as they did, they could have increased public education, I think somewhere around 10% with the money that they cut in just the last couple of years. That could have been a 10% boost to public education. And now it's not going anywhere because it's going into the pockets of the top income earners in the state. And they claim that they did stuff for people at the lower income, but the earned income tax credit that they put in place for lower income earners, it's not refundable. So they won't see that money. It's just a tax credit. It's not refundable at all. That's another one of the tricks that they've done. They had a lot of money from income taxes floating around, and they had to make the choice. Does that go into the schools or does that go into tax cuts? Because those were the only things that they could have done with it. They can't take money from that fund for education. They can't take it out of there and put it to other parts of the budget. They're not allowed to do that under the Constitution. Oh, and by the way, a couple of years ago, they got tired of reporters like me pointing out that this was money that could go to public education. So they just changed the name of the fund. So it's no longer the education fund. We had two funds. We have the general fund, which is where your sales taxes and your fees and all the other money goes into. And then you have what used to be known as the education fund, because that's where the money would go, the education. Well, they changed the name of the education fund. It's now the income tax fund, because it's a lot easier to cut money and take money out of that for tax cuts because it's the income tax fund, not the education fund. But that's where the money is supposed to go. It was a very Orwellian move at the time. They just get tired of people yelling at them. One of the things that happened, and you can go back and look at the floor debates on this, when they passed HB 267, the union busting bill, They were negotiating with the unions to come up with a way to soften the bill. They had talks with the unions about that. And part of those talks was that the unions were going to be neutral on whatever compromise they came up with. They weren't going to oppose it. They could endorse it if they liked it, but if they didn't like it, they would just remain neutral. Well, lawmakers thought that remaining neutral means the union members would stop calling and yelling at them. But that didn't happen. Union members kept calling and yelling at lawmakers, and that hurt their tender feelings. And so that's why they all of a sudden went back to the original version of the bill and rammed it through, because they didn't like getting yelled at. It was a very 12-year-old thing to do. Comment from YouTube, Nathan Detroit. Nathan is one of my subscribers. He's in our Discord. I always like hearing from Nathan. He says, great book on going after public school education. They Came for the Schools by Mike Hicksonbaugh. Heard of that one. I want to read it. It's on my list. Nathan also says, the Ledge loves to pat themselves on the back for doing the bare minimum. They brag about balancing the budget every year when that's a constitutional requirement. Yeah, exactly. They have to do it. They have to have a balanced budget. M. Gallaty on Instagram says, well, here's hoping they don't come up with a California Prop 13 style answer to property taxes. That's been a mess for California. Again, I don't know what they're going to be able to do at the state level. That is almost exclusively at the local level. There's really not a lot that lawmakers can do about it. They're very aware that this is a problem. They've been talking about this for years, but have they been able to find a solution? Not one that they can get through. There's really not one that they can get enough support on and pass. I want to talk a little bit about what it means when they move the filing deadlines for the congressional elections, which they did in the special session. This is a change that benefits incumbents and more well-known candidates. There's no other way to put it. It makes it harder for candidates to introduce themselves. It makes it harder for candidates who are lesser known to get in front of the voters, develop some name ID, and at the same time, they have to get their campaign infrastructure. And it's going to shorten the time between the actual filing for office and the primary, because the filing starts on March 9th. And I'm thinking about for the Democratic Party. So they start on March 9th, and then the convention is on April 25th, the Democratic statewide convention, where they will vote, assuming that this first congressional district in Salt Lake County stands. So it's really not a fair move for candidates who aren't as well known, who don't have a lot of money, who have to take time to introduce themselves to voters. It really is a benefit for incumbents who have this infrastructure in place already, and for more well-known candidates who already have some name ID. As a wise campaign worker said to me once, you either have name ID or you spend money to get name ID. And shortening this timeline, it gives the legislature time to appeal in this case, but it also puts these candidates at a disadvantage. Some more budget questions. Ryan 5000S on TikTok says, can they now underfund social programs and then pull money from income tax to compensate? The answer is no. The programs that are already funded by the social programs for disabled Utahns, and it's only for disabled people who live in the state. That's the only one where this income tax money can go towards. So they can't underfund another social program and then pull money. There is a hard wall. That constitutional earmark is so rock solid, they cannot get around it. So I understand your thinking, but they're just not allowed to do that. Question from Nathan Detroit. For the filing date move, can candidates not use campaign funds until after the filing date? No, they can use campaign funds. They're running for Congress, so they're under FEC rules, not Utah's rules. Once you either raise or spend $5,000 on a congressional campaign, you are required to start filing with the Federal Election Commission. Them's the rules. A lot of candidates file just so they can start raising money because they know they're going to raise more than that. Philip Graves, 6823, says, how was the U as a public university able to sell off half of its athletic department? I don't pretend to understand that. Those are financial waters that I do not swim in, and I will never swim in. So I don't understand how that works. I think it is a big deal. I think there is a lot of risk, and I think that there's a lot of reward. I think it is an extremely bold move. I don't cover college sports. I don't understand the mechanism by the way they were able to do this. The Big Ten, they were bringing in a bunch of private equity money as well. But this is the one for one specific school, and they're raising a lot of money. I think they're creating, the way that I understand it is they've created a private entity that is now over their athletic department. And the University of Utah is still the majority shareholder. They're still the majority owner. But this private equity group, they're coming in to raise money, deal with NIL payments and paying players, because we have the House settlement that allows universities to start paying players and revenue share. And revenue share is probably $20 million a year at minimum. And if you look at across the college football landscape, and this is primarily going to impact college football, this is a move primarily for college football, but you look at all these schools and they're in debt. Ohio State, I think it's around $60-70 million in debt. Other schools are in the red. They're losing money hand over fist because they have to pay players. They have to pay NIL now. It's a different world. And so this is a move to try and make it so that the University of Utah, at least their athletic department, is going to be in the black in this new world. Now, you hear people decrying the end of amateur athletics. I think that ship sailed a long time ago. This is essentially a professional league. And like it or not, the University of Utah is addressing the reality of the situation where college sports is now, especially college football, it's now a development league for the NFL. It always has been, but now it really is. The players just weren't paid before. At least they weren't paid openly. So this is just an acknowledgement. I think that there's a lot of risk. There's a lot of risk with this, but there's also a lot of reward. I think the bottom line is things at the University of Utah or associated with the University of Utah are going to get more expensive because what does private equity do? They have to maximize profit. That's what they do. Again, these are financial waters that I do not swim in. I don't pretend to understand all the mechanisms, but I think it is at least an acknowledgement of where we are going in college sports. And I think the ultimate destination is we're just going to get to like a 64-team super league of teams. And I think ultimately this was a move to ensure that the University of Utah is going to be on the inside of that league, like among the haves. You do not want to get frozen out, because if this 64-team super league happens, and I think that is a extremely likely possibility. I think the University of Utah would be on the outside looking in if they hadn't made this deal. And it's going to put pressure on a lot of other schools. I'm sure other schools are going to try to find a way to get in on this. As someone said to me, this is going to put pressure on other schools, and crumble cookie is not the long-term solution. BYU is not going to be able to go back to that well for forever. Nathan Detroit says, if you're LSU, you're paying a man not to coach your football team. Taxpayers are paying a man not to coach their team. They did the same thing at Texas A&M with Jimbo Fisher. They had to get $100 million of donors so they could buy him out and get him out the door. These contracts are crazy. We've got a little bit of downtime now, although we're going to have the appeals to the Utah Supreme Court. And one of the changes that lawmakers made on Tuesday is that those appeals have to be handled in an expedited manner. They're not going to be able to sit around for a long time. They're going to have to make a decision sooner rather than later. One thing that kind of slipped by, and I think I was the only person who really caught it, but there was a provision in that bill to move the filing dates that if you read it, it looks like it's a way to blunt some of the problems that have arisen from Phil Lyman and his people to try and undo his election loss in 2024. There's a small change in the bill. It's permanent, though. And what it does is it directs the Office of Elections, the State Elections Director, to come up with a rule that will allow candidates to turn in their signature packets on a weekly basis instead of all at once. You normally collect all your packets and then turn them in at once, and then they get counted. And no matter how many packets you've turned in, once they reach the threshold, a statewide election, 28,000, congressional elections, 7,000, and on down the list, once they reach the required number of signatures, they stop counting, no matter how many packets you have left. That is one of the things that Phil Lyman and his merry band of conspiracy theorists have seized on to try and throw doubt on Governor Spencer Cox's win in the 2024 GOP primary. Because Cox turned in a bunch of signatures, and once they reached 28,000, they stopped counting. I think it was just a little bit over, like 28,300. But there were a bunch of packets that were not counted. The signatures weren't verified. There was no need. Cox had enough signatures. Well, there were some audits after the election that looked at how those signatures were verified, and Lyman's supporters and Phil Lyman himself have mischaracterized the results of those findings to support his theory that he is the one true governor of Utah or whatever. He's the one who should be sitting he was unjustly blocked from the governorship, which is not how it works, and that's really stupid, but he's misrepresented those findings. Well, under this change, candidates can now start turning in their packets on a weekly basis. And so it will be a rolling count of how many signatures they have. That also helps candidates because they can also keep track of their signature validation rate, see how many are thrown out, where they might need to get more, if they're going to fall short. So it helps candidates as well. But I think it really is targeted at Phil Lyman and his nonsense, because now they'll turn in these packets and they'll keep counting. And once you get to the threshold, they'll keep counting. They'll keep doing the validation because they're spreading it out. At least that's the way that I read this rule. So it's a part of the bill that's designed to knock off, or to tell Phil Lyman to knock it off, or prevent his shenanigans from happening in the future. Lo-Fi Mexican Cooking says, this actually seems like a good idea. I think it's a good idea. It's a benefit to campaigns. Like I said, you can track how your signatures, the validation rate. If you're only at an 80% validation rate, meaning 20% of your signatures are getting thrown out, you're obviously going to want to go back out into the field and get more. And you'll have plenty of time to do that. And it also takes a lot of the pressure off of the clerks who are validating those signatures. So it's a good idea. But the subtext, if you read it, it's to tell Phil Lyman to knock it off. Mother Trucka, love your name, on TikTok says, I've been getting notifications for Bluin in my FYP. What do you know about his position? Go to my podcast. I just conducted an interview with him. I have a long-form interview with him, a conversation about who he is, why he's running. It's in my podcast. The podcast is called Special Session with Brian Schott. I've done two interviews with congressional candidates. I also interviewed Ben McAdams. I'm scheduled next week to talk with Derek Kitchen, who's also running in that first congressional district. And it's a pretty good conversation. So I would encourage you to go to my podcast. You can find it on YouTube. You can find it anywhere you get your podcast. It's also linked on my website. That's utahpolitics.news. What I will tell you is Nate Bluin is a progressive candidate, unabashedly progressive. He is probably the most progressive candidate in the race so far. at least that I'm aware of. I'm sure that there may be others in there, but he is probably the most high, I'll put it this way, the most high-profile progressive candidate in the race for Congress. He is young. He's part of this youth movement that's starting to take hold on the Democratic side here in Utah. He's part of the New Guard. He's been in the state Senate for one term. He was elected after Gene Davis. He stomped Gene Davis in a primary. Gene Davis, longtime state senator, was embroiled in a number of controversies surrounding inappropriate behavior with an intern. He tried to run for one more term, and Nate saw his opportunity and pretty much spanked him in the primary, and that's how he got into the state legislature. So he's been up there for 3 years. He's got 1 year left. Very active on social media. But if you want a longer conversation, you can find it on my podcast, on my website, utahpolitics.news. I would encourage you to go there. I did have a story last week about the House Republican caucus holding a retreat at the Zermatt Resort near Midway. Taxpayers footed the bill, $26,584 for a day and a half retreat at Zermatt. They booked a block of rooms, and then they had catering for all of their meetings. The catering cost was over $10,000 alone. There were 51 lawmakers, I believe, who attended, but there were 51 members of the House, only Republicans, and a dozen staffers plus one intern who all went up there for this retreat. Taxpayers footed the bill for that. And I think it's interesting because if you contrast it with the way that the Democratic caucus handles their planning sessions, it's much different. Now, granted, the Democratic caucus is smaller. There are 61 Republicans. There are 14 Democrats. Their staff is smaller. I think they have one full-time staffer and then a part-time communications person. But they meet at the Capitol, and they have bagels and maybe pizza or sandwiches. If they have a speaker, they pay for that out of the PAC fund. So taxpayers essentially pay for the meeting space at the Capitol because they paid for that building. And then they have some operating budget that they use to cater with sandwiches. Meanwhile, the House Republican caucus booked 60 some odd rooms at Zermatt, stayed overnight, had $10,000 in catering, and brought in a facilitator from Montana who they paid $2,300. And they could have paid for all of that out of their PACs. The Speaker of the House is sitting on hundreds of thousands of dollars in the two political action committees he controls. He has the Speaker's PAC, this House Speaker Leadership PAC, and there's also the House Republican Election PAC, which they use to support their members in the re-election bid. And those two combined have more than close to, I think, $400,000 in them. So they could have easily picked up the tab for this stay at Zermatt using the PAC money, but they decided to charge it to taxpayers. You can read that full report on my website, utahpolitics.news.